Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show, we have David Fields to talk about an upcoming publication he has with the University of Kentucky Press. This book, which will come out early next year, will focus on the early life of Syngman Rhee. Now, early life in a sense, this is life until 1945. But this, of course, is also the period that people pay no attention to when it comes to Syngman Rhee. The focus always is on the man he becomes after 1945. But in 1945, he's already 70 years old. David Fields takes us back to the important early years of his life, to his early Confucian influences, which of course is the influence across all of Korea at that time. Then moving into an education which becomes Western, at a Christian missionary school. And it doesn't take long for him to become an independence fighter. Yet strangely, an independence fighter for a Korea which at that time was independent. But Syngman Rhee could see what was coming. He could see that Korea wouldn't survive very long. Soon enough, through these independence activities, Rhee is captured and imprisoned for what turns out to be a life sentence. Upon early release, Rhee wastes very little time. Soon enough, now a converted Christian, and with the help of his missionary friends, he finds himself in America, a country where he would eventually spend almost 40 years of his life. This period of exile covers a remarkable education, and also a career as a lecturer. But more importantly, it is the diplomatic efforts that he undertakes at this time that matter. He begins very quickly to bang on the door of his host, to demand that they support the call for an independent, single nationalized Korea. Along the way, he reaches out to the Soviet Union. He returns briefly to Korea. He becomes the first president of the Korean Provisional Government, a government in exile that was formed after the March 1st uprising. But what becomes apparent is that Rhee is seeing the world through the eyes of the people around him. He manipulates the ideas of American society and American culture. He pushes them to embrace his idea of Korean nationalism. And as David Fields will show, he is successful, but a bit too successful, because Rhee's campaign itself ends up contributing to the division of Korea along the 38th parallel. The one thing he always wanted, a single, unified, independent Korea, is suddenly lost, at least in part due to the exercise and the activities of Rhee himself. Over the following podcast, we will dig into these ideas, try at least in part to unpack Rhee's life leading up to 1945. We will do this through David Fields' pending publication, soon to be available from the University of Kentucky Press. A lot of David's research here walks on new ground. And throughout the interview, I'm playing catch up. I'm just fighting to stay in the game. But it was an absolutely enjoyable experience. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast and you consider it in any way valuable, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached to this podcast, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So, without any further delay, this is David Fields. David Fields, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so we're going to be working through the early life of Syngman Rhee, or at least the life until 1945. But just to give us some context, who was he after 1945? Because people tend to know him for the person he became after that period.
He's definitely an individual who is defined by the last 20 years of his life, which when you live to be 90 years is probably a frustrating thing to be so well known for what happens at the end. After 1945, he's the first president of the Republic of Korea from 1948 to 1960, at which point he resigns under pressure from really a quite virulent protest movement called the April Revolution in Korea in April of 1960. He resigns and then he goes into exile into the United States and Hawaii and dies there in 1965. But during his presidency, he's probably most famous for his virulent anti-communism. He's a very staunch anti-communist. He brings the Republic of Korea into a very close relationship with the United States, both before, during, and after the Korean War. Enters a mutual security alliance with the United States in 1953. And really, those are the things that he's known for the best.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the sort of thing that catch people's minds, because that's what that seems to have focused on here. But we're going to wind this right back now. So let's go back to his very early childhood. So he's born in North Korea and to quite I guess a royal bloodline of sorts. But I suppose there's a lot more there. So let's unpack his very early years of his life.
Sure. He's born, of course, into what today is North Korea. At the time, it's unified Korea under the Chosun state. And he is born to a royal bloodline, but actually we should use the Korean term Yangban, which is roughly translates into a European or Western concept of hereditary nobility. Now, as is the problem with many Yangban in Korea, many of these families have that bloodline, but they don't necessarily have the wealth that goes along with it. So it was possible at this time in late Chosun to be a Yangban family and to be actually somewhat poor. And that was the case that was Lee Syngman or Syngman Rhee's family. They were not poor or destitute, but compared to other Yangban around, they were not very wealthy at all. I believe they had only one servant, at least servant is how Syngman Rhee liked to refer to him. It was probably more like a slave. And his father lived a very lavish lifestyle, traveling around quite a bit, entertaining his friends, but often without very much money or wasting family money on that. So Syngman Rhee grew up in a noble family, but also under rather modest circumstances.
Is that the reason why his two elder brothers seem to have died? Do you know?
I don't know, and I don't know that he had two elder brothers. I know he had one elder brother, and I believe his elder brother died while he was still quite young. I don't know exactly what age it is, but while still a child. And so I assume that he died of the kind of things that was killing young children all throughout human history, really until the 20th century, childhood diseases. And I don't know that his economic status would have really made much of a difference in that. I mean, I don't know what kind of traditional medicine that he had access to. The interesting thing is Syngman Rhee almost certainly would have died when he was 6 years old, had it not been for Western medicine. He came down with some sort of illness that's not been identified, but it caused temporary blindness. And reportedly, he was very near death. His family tried everything they could in terms of traditional medicine. And finally, in an act of true desperation, they took him to Seoul to be seen by the only Western doctor in Korea, who provided, again, the details of this are very hazy, but provided some Western medicine to Syngman Rhee, which both saved his life and restored his sight. And this is an interesting point of conflict and myth in Syngman Rhee's biography, because in his 1956 biography by Robert T. Oliver, it's claimed that that doctor is Horace Allen, who was an American missionary who was also the doctor to the American legation in Seoul, and it's claimed that Allen was the one who treated Rhee and who saved his sight, and that's the beginning of Rhee's opening to Western culture and influences. Now, this is certainly not true. Allen did not arrive in Korea until Syngman Rhee was 9 years old. He's very clear in his autobiographical writings that this happened while he was 6. And it's interesting that probably Robert Oliver inserted this into the biography himself, because I've seen copies of the page proofs that are at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've seen the correspondence between Rhee's later wife, Francesca Rhee, and Oliver, saying that Allen's name should have never been mentioned in this context. She never explicitly denies that it was Allen who did this, but said that this is clearly an error that his name was used. And probably the reason they wanted to set the record straight was, one, Allen didn't do it, but they didn't want to identify the doctor specifically, because almost certainly the doctor that treated Lee Syngman was a Japanese doctor, and was the doctor of the Japanese legation. And if you know much about Korean history through the colonial period and after, any association with the Japanese is essentially the kiss of death on one's reputation. So having Lee Syngman's life saved and his sight restored by a Japanese doctor is not such a convenient thing for a Korean nationalist.
That's quite an important discovery there, because in a lot of the reading I did, it was Allen that treated him, right? So that's quite an interesting thing to discover. And of course, what you're saying there is Allen was a missionary as well. And a lot of the early influence that comes to Rhee is through American missionaries and the Methodist school that he went to.
That's absolutely correct. The missionaries they play an incredible forming role in Rhee's life, and this happens. So to go back into his education for just a little bit, Rhee has a classical Korean education. He's drilled in the Chinese characters and Confucian texts. But when the Japanese institute reforms in the late 1890s, they abolished the kwago, the state examination that Rhee has been studying for to try to become a Korean bureaucrat. When they abolished this examination, it's almost as if his whole life goal had to be changed immediately, because this whole thing that he was preparing for was no longer an option. And it seems of his own volition, he decides, okay, well, if I can't take the state examination, obviously what I need to study is Western learning. I need to study Western culture. And so he leaves his pursuit of a traditional education, instead enters a Peije Hakdang, or often referred to as Peije Middle School, which is a school in Seoul founded by Methodist missionaries. And he goes there with the stated purpose of just receiving a technical education. He's not interested in Western philosophy. He's not interested in Christianity even. He wants to learn English. He wants to learn things like geography and mathematics. And what it seems like he's hoping to do is he's hoping to become a new kind of bureaucrat in what he hopes will be a modernizing Korean state.
But at some point here, I mean, there's a lot of divergent thought on this, but at some point here, he actually embraces Christianity. He converts himself. Is this at this early point, or is this a little bit later on in his life?
This is not at this point. This is actually after he's imprisoned in the late 1890s. He's imprisoned in 1899, and he's in prison until 1904. And it's somewhere fairly early on in his incarceration, probably the 1899 or 1900, where he converts to Christianity in prison. So there's an interesting dance that goes on between Syngman Rhee and his missionary patrons for several years while he's at Peije, because he's clearly one of their most gifted students. He picks up English incredibly quickly. He becomes something of an orator. He's giving speeches. He founds what's Korea's first debating society, and they eventually come to the point where they're debating issues of national importance, such as Korea's future, how Korea is going to maintain its independence, is sandwiched between Japan, Russia, and China. So he's clearly such a gifted student, but he's not a Christian. And he's quite explicitly not a Christian. And he reassures his parents all the time that they need not worry about him studying with Christian missionaries, because their religion is so foolish that it's impossible that any man of learning would go for it. It's only the poor people who are converting to Christianity. And this causes some friction, especially because as he becomes more politically active, he starts putting these missionaries at risk, or at least putting their school at risk, because it looks like they're radicalizing students in their school, which in fact they are, and they're uncomfortable with that. But at the same time, they see students like Syngman Rhee, and they think these are the future leaders of Korea. If we can only get them to convert to Christianity and actually go in the direction we want, this is exactly the kind of change we're trying to effect. So there's some tense years between Rhee and the missionaries as he's going clearly his own way. But then when he converts to Christianity in prison, they recognize immediately that this is a future leader who is now on their side, and they do everything they can to support him in his endeavors.
So let's move into those troubled years then, the reason that he ends up in prison. So as you're saying, he becomes a political activist very, very young. And of course, this is, I believe, in large part simply to do with the occupation that his country is under, but also the corruption of local Koreans as well.
It's actually the other way. He becomes an independence activist. And the interesting thing is, there's this organization in Korea called the Independence Club, founded by Philip Jason, who is also a Korean, but a Korean who's been educated in the United States, who comes back to Korea after an exile, and he is hired to teach really the humanities courses at Peije Hakdang, or Peije Middle School. And so it's really under Jason's teaching that Rhee becomes radicalized. So you have a missionary school, but you have a missionary school with Korean teachers who are much more radical than the missionaries there. Most of the missionaries in Peije are not really into politics at all. They want to convert Koreans to Christianity, and they also want to introduce Western concepts and modern technology into Korea. So they do have a cultural mission, but they try to stay out of politics as much as possible because they recognize this is one sure way of limiting their influence and maybe even closing down their schools. So it's actually at Pae-jae that Rhee is radicalized by this Korean Philip Jae-sun. And together they found, or actually Jae-sun founds the Independence Club. Rhee becomes a prominent member of it. But the interesting thing is this Independence Club dedicated to the independence of Korea is actually founded when Korea is still an independent nation, which is kind of funny when you think about it. But people who understood the Korean political situation well understood in the late 1890s that there's no way Korea was going to maintain its independence into the 20th centuries without serious reform. So
why was that? Did they see Japan looming over their shoulder, or was this something else?
They saw Japan and they saw Russia looming over their shoulder. They saw the Chinese, who had had a complicated relationship with the Koreans, but in many cases acted as almost the guarantor of Korea's independence. They saw the Chinese influence waning, and they recognized that it was only a matter of time before either Russia or Japan entered into some sort of unequal relationship with Korea. So the activists in the Independence Club were working as hard as they could to prevent this from happening. And they said the only way we can prevent this from happening is serious reforms at home, especially in the Korean government and in Korean society. So what they wanted was they wanted Western education. They wanted things like mathematics, geometry, geography, these things that we think of as an education now. They wanted them taught as opposed to Confucian texts. And they also wanted the government transformed into, now depending on how radical you were, anything between a constitutional monarchy or an outright democracy or a republic. And it was really for his advocacy of governmental reform, especially advocating a constitutional monarchy, that Lee Syngman is eventually arrested and imprisoned.
So what form do those protests take? Are these ever violent, or are they simply, is he just writing pamphlets? Is he protesting on streets, or is he actually trying to physically manipulate the levers of power himself? They do become violent, but they become violent. How these protests happens is Rhee always referred to them as mass meetings. So they would hold mass meetings, often in front of one of the palaces in downtown Seoul. They would get people together and they would have a series of speakers. Lee Syngman was a very prominent one, who would get out in front of the people and make an argument for why Korea needed drastic reforms, pointing out the corruption of the officials, and they would really get the people worked up. Now, when it became violent was often when the royalists would send out hired thugs to come and break up the protests. And on these situations, the activists would often flee, but Lee Syngman would often fight as well. And he would often sometimes have to fight his way out of these melees, and in some cases was injured quite badly. He was very proud of this. He was very proud that he was willing to get out there and mix it up for the cause that he believed in. But eventually, at the end of the day, these activists were always broken up, and they would end up running to Pae-jae, or they would run to one of the foreign legations in town, and they would hide under the protection of extraterritoriality provisions. So they would basically run to the missionaries and be protected. And the missionaries did this because they recognized, especially with Lee Syngman, how valuable he could be as a future leader of Korea. But this also put them in a terrible situation. They did not approve of his political activity, and they were really worried that pretty soon it was going to have repercussions for their own ministry in Korea. So there's really a delicate situation between Syngman Rhee and the missionaries throughout this period. So what is he actually arrested for, and when does this happen? After all this, after this continues, eventually he is arrested and he's put in prison for a serious period of his life. So what was he there for, and what were these periods? They seem to be quite a defining period of his life, those prison years as well.
They certainly are. So what he's arrested for is eventually, through bringing this kind of pressure, he is able to force, and not just him, the other activists, there's the other activists in the Independence Club as well. They're able to force changes in the Korean government, and one of them is setting up a privy council that will kind of act as advisors to the king on state issues, or to the emperor by this point. And it's important to understand that as these protests grow more and more violent, more and more moderates leave the movement. So Philip J. Sun actually ends up leaving the movement and returning to the United States when he says, we're not going to accomplish anything here. All we're going to do is create a more and more violent situation. And so the moderate leaders leave, and they end up ceding the field to people like Syngman Rhee, who are more radical. So what he's arrested for is when he gets on this Privy Council, he recommends the recall of Pak Young-hyo and these other Koreans who had been involved in previous reform movements and also tangentially involved in the murder of Queen Min during an uprising of reformists in Korea. And this is about as radical as you can get, calling these people who many of the royalists view as regicides, calling them back to Korea and saying that these people deserve a place of influence in Korea's modernization reform. Most of his contemporaries look on this action by Syngman Rhee and say this was ultimately about the most foolish thing that he could have done. I mean, he'd just gotten some reforms enacted in the government. He'd placed himself and other reformers in a position of influence with the king, and then to overreach in this regard was just unthinkable to them. And this is what leads to his arrest. This is where he crosses the line in the Koreans' mind from a reformer to a radical. And now the interesting thing is so they order his arrest, and he flees to an American legation. And if he just would have stayed there, and probably would have stayed there for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, he probably would have been okay. But he doesn't. For reasons that are somewhat obscure, he leaves the legation with an American missionary, thinking that if he's with the missionary, he'll be fine. It turns out that that was not the case. And the moment he leaves the legation, even though he's in the company of an American missionary, he's arrested and he's imprisoned. Now, even there, he might have been okay. The missionaries are visiting him every day. They're using their influence with the court to try to get him released. They're seeing that he's not tortured. But again, his radicalism shows through, and he decides to hatch an escape plot from prison. He and a few friends manage to have some weapons smuggled into them. They break out of prison, shooting a guard in the process, and they are instantly captured once they get out. And now he moves from being a political dissident to really a felon. He's sentenced to life in prison, although some of his accomplices were given the death sentence. And now he's essentially placed beyond the reach of his missionary patrons. He's tortured seriously, very seriously, during this first year that he's now in as a convicted felon, and very well could have gotten the death sentence. And it's probably because of all of his friends in the reform movement, because of American missionaries, that they managed to spare his life, although they do not spare him an absolutely miserable experience and several weeks of torture.
But they do manage to bring him a lot of materials, I understand. So from prison, just like a lot of these great revolutionaries do, they produce a lot of work. And it seems that Rhee he wrote, well, I believe 3 or 4 books from prison, and he seems to have been flooded with study materials from his missionary friends.
This eventually does happen. Yeah, eventually after his conversion to Christianity, the missionaries, they're working as hard as they can to alleviate the really cruel conditions he's living in. And they are somewhat successful in that. But during this period, more moderate reformers, some of them royalists, also come into position of influence in the Korean court, and they're urging the powers that be to ease up on Lee Seung-man a little bit. And one of the things that he's allowed to do is eventually he's allowed to write in prison and have his editorials published in local newspapers in Seoul, calling for different types of reform. Now, he had to do this secretly, but obviously there were people involved who knew what was going on. He doesn't sign these things. They're written anonymously, but he does quite a bit of writing while he's in prison, as you say. And he writes what comes to be his really magnum opus, which is the Dongnip Changshin, or The Spirit of Independence, which is a remarkable book. It's a roadmap for Korea remaining independent at a time when Korea is still nominally independent, but it's obvious that it's going to lose it. And what's so interesting about this book is Syngman Rhee is incredibly hard on Koreans. I mean, if this was written by a Westerner, you would read most of this today as racist twaddle. But when it's written by a Korean in the reform movement, it takes on a different tact. He's telling Koreans the uncomfortable truth that their society is lagging seriously behind not just Western society, but behind the Japanese. And if they don't do things to reform themselves very, very quickly, they're going to end up a colony of someone. And I like to describe the strategy that he lays out for maintaining Korea's independence in this book as a reform from within and protection from without, because he recognizes that Korea needs drastic reforms from within, but also that they don't have time to make these reforms without some external protection. So he talks a lot about, in Dongnip Cheongshin, about foreign diplomacy and how it's going to be necessary for Korea to enter the community of nations and behave itself very well in that community, and to pursue treaties with other people in that community to get its independence recognized by other states. And just perhaps using this foreign recognition, they can delay the inevitable long enough to strengthen themselves from within and resist either Japanese or Russian designs on the Korean Peninsula. And at this point, he's actually not sure who poses the greater threat to the Korean Peninsula, the Japanese or the Russians.
And that point you make there about this outreach and diplomacy is going to come through a lot, what we're going to speak about in a second here. But first of all, he gets out of prison. So he doesn't do a life sentence, of course. He's out of prison in 5 years. So how does he get out, and what happens after that?
Well, that is also a matter of some debate. And it's the American missionaries have been working behind the scenes constantly to try to get him released, arguing that he's essentially a political prisoner. He made a terrible mistake when he tried to force his escape, but he's really not a criminal. In fact, he's someone who's very, very useful. In prison, he actually transforms himself into a scholar. He starts the first Korean English dictionary and gets all the way to the letter F before before the Russo-Japanese War breaks out, and then he turns his scholarly energies to writing about the war. So anyway, he's transformed himself into a scholar, and the American missionaries are making the argument that this is the kind of person that you're going to need in a future modernized Korea. This is the kind of person who can speak English, who's read widely while he's in prison, who has really transformed himself into one of the most cosmopolitan of Korean citizens. There's also some interesting possibilities that as the Japanese are now occupying Korea, they recognize in Syngman Rhee too someone useful. They recognize that he is a Korean modernizer. They like to think of themselves as people who are also going to modernize Korea. They probably suspect he has no love lost for traditional Korea after the king has thrown him in prison for 5 years. And so it's also possible that the Japanese exert their influence, their growing influence, to get Syngman Rhee released as a potential ally.
Yeah, so after he is released and he's out of prison, I understand he went to America almost immediately, and this is, at least it's called a period of exile. Almost immediately. He spends, there's about 4 to 6 weeks after he's released from prison. He's trying to decide what he's going to do. He's been offered the position of principal at a school that's roughly similar to Peje Hakdang, another missionary school. But the question on his mind, and really on the missionary mind, has he been de-radicalized enough to actually function in Korea, or is he going to fall out with the Japanese just as he had fallen out with the Korean monarchy? And this is very much a concern of the American missionaries, and it seems that it's they who really suggest to him, look, you've really learned a lot, you've really transformed yourself in prison, but now is the time to go to the United States to get a proper Western education, go to college, go to graduate school, and then you can come back to Korea, and then you can have even more influence. And this, I think they want an education for him, but they also are hoping if we send him to the United States for a few more years, maybe he can get all the radicalism out of his system, he can settle down somewhat, and he can come back to Korea and be someone more useful for us who's not going to be causing political controversies either with the Korean state, if it still exists, or with the Japanese. Now, he's also approached at this time, he says, by the emperor's representatives and then by the foreign minister to undertake a secret mission asking the United States to assist Korea in what they see is going to be a
a struggle for Korean independence against the Japanese. And now we have to go back here just a little bit to 1882.
Sure.
In 1882, the United States and Korea sign a treaty, the first clause of which is a standard good offices clause. This was put in many treaties in the late 19th century, which says if one of our two countries comes into difficulties with a third party, each other will offer their good offices to mediate the dispute. And this means that the other party would try to step in and try to help along the negotiations. Well, this is there's no quite term for good offices in Korea. And so the Koreans actually interpret this treaty as if we get in difficulties with a third country, the other party is obligated to help. And they think of it more as an alliance. Now, they should not have thought of it that way. The State Department and American officials had made clear many times that this was, in fact, not an alliance. But the Korean court chooses to continue to try to treat this as if it is an alliance out of desperation. And so when Rhee is released from prison, they ask him to go to the United States to try to meet with American officials to get them to honor the Korean understanding of the 1882 treaty. Rhee says that he refuses this once the emperor offers it because he's still not on good terms with the emperor, but he accepts it when other people in the court suggest it to him. And so he leaves for the United States in late 1904, both planning to get an education and also hoping to invoke the 1882 Korean-American Treaty in front of the State Department and American officials.
Now, he's unsuccessful in invoking that treaty, of course, because it never really existed in that format. But his education is quite remarkable. And, of course, this is not a brief trip to America. Over the years, he actually spent about 40 years inside the United States. And he makes a very close relation, well, not very close, but he makes a very important relationship early on through the education with Woodrow Wilson.
Yes. Now we should say he is not successful in getting the Americans to do anything with this 1882 treaty, but he is remarkably successful in bringing it to the attention of Americans. And he actually is remarkably successful in that he secures a meeting with Theodore Roosevelt in 1905 and actually is able to present a memorial from the Korean people asking the United States to honor this treaty. Now, Roosevelt actually does an interesting dance to get out of it. He doesn't point out that, well, this is not a treaty. Instead, what he says is that, well, this is very interesting, but I can't act on this unless it's coming from an official source, meaning it has to come through the Korean Foreign Ministry and the Korean legation in Washington. So yet these missions that Lee Syngman is on, these are secret missions, okay? So Roosevelt is saying, well, this is very interesting to me, but I can't just take your word for it. You know, I need to hear this through an official Korean source. And Lee Syngman leaves the meeting with Roosevelt thinking that he has just saved Korea, that as soon as he gets the Korean minister in Washington to deliver the same message, that the United States is going to come to Korea's aid. Well, what Roosevelt already knows and Lee Syngman doesn't know is actually the Korean Foreign Ministry is under the control of the Japanese, and they've placed pliant officials throughout the ministry, including in the legation in Washington. And when Rhee arrives at the legation, he finds out that there's no one there who will deliver the message in an official capacity, and this gives Roosevelt the perfect excuse to say, well, I could not act on the treaty because I was never officially informed of the case. And this becomes very important, both in Lee Syngman's career, because even though he fails, Koreans are astounded that he was actually able to meet with the president. And this is covered widely in actually American media and also Korean media. And this is really where Rhee transforms himself from someone who is a radical reformer to someone who shows promise as an American diplomat, or as an international diplomat. I don't think that there was anyone thinking that he would actually be able to present his case to someone that high up in the U.S. government. So it's a remarkable success. It's also important because later on, Roosevelt will justify his decision to not defend the Korea from the Japanese, not by saying that I never was informed of the case, but rather by saying that it was unreasonable for anyone to do for the Koreans what they were utterly unable to do for themselves. That's how he justifies his inaction later on in 1919. And this is important because this gives Syngman Rhee a grievance that then he can bring before the American people for the rest of his career, saying that you turned your back on a treaty. that you had this treaty with Korea, we informed you of the case, and you said, well, we know we have this treaty, but we're not going to do anything to defend you. So he accuses the United States of violating this treaty, and in a very, very technical sense, he may have been right about that. And he's certainly able to convince many Americans that this was the case.
And during those diplomatic years inside America, and I'm getting this from your writings themselves, he made a lot of friends with the socialist left. And of course, this is going to be important when it comes back towards the division of Korea. But during these years, he had no qualms with the communist left or the socialist left themselves. And he found some of his most important allies in these movements.
This was certainly one of the most surprising things that I discovered. And I became the editor of Rhee's diary in 2015, the project that took a couple of years. And all scholars of Rhee have known for a long time that he had a lot of friends in the United States, some of them quite influential. What we didn't know was exactly who they were. And it was not until this diary came out in the public that for the first time you could go through and you could see the names of who Rhee was meeting with, who he was associating with, who he was hiring to work for various Korean diplomatic offices. And one of the things that really surprised me as I started IDing these Americans is how many of them were from the left of center of American society at that time. Now, it's important to understand that this shouldn't be that surprising to us, except when we think about Rhee's later years, because in the early 20th century, it's generally people of the left of center in American society that were the most progressive on racial issues. And we must never forget that Syngman Rhee is a Korean. He's an Asian operating in the United States at a time where there's exclusion laws, where there's explicitly racial-based restrictions on what Asians can do in the United States. And so it shouldn't be surprising that Rhee would have a hard time working with people who are quite conservative if they also hold explicitly racist or anti-Asian views, and that he would gravitate towards people who are more likely to see racial issues in terms of a future brotherhood of man, as we're all struggling against oppression together. And so it really shouldn't be a surprise, given where Rhee comes from, that he would find company and assistance from people who were decidedly left of center. It's only surprising when we let the last 20 years of Rhee's life define the first 70 years of his life. And that's when this becomes a really surprising and interesting discovery. It's also interesting that a lot of these left of center people he's associating with are Christians. And Christian socialism is not an oxymoron at all at this time. There's a lot of Christians arguing that social reforms and addressing economic inequality is really the only true way they can manifest their faith.
So is it correct to say that Syngman Rhee, I mean, after he comes to power, people begin to see him as an extremely right-wing, extremely conservative, and quite an authoritarian person? But is this just a deep pragmatism? Is he essentially a non-ideological man beyond the idea of a Korean independent nationalism? That's
exactly what I would say. I would say throughout this period, especially prior to 1945, Rhee is a pragmatist above all else, and he understands that he is fighting almost a hopeless battle to restore Korea's independence. It's hard to see how this is going to succeed, but if there's going to be any chance for it to succeed, he's got to take help from wherever he can get it. And so the fact that someone is a socialist is not important to him. Actually, the fact that someone is a racist is not important to him. And another one of these surprising relationships that comes up is his relationship with V.S. McClatchy, who is seen as a leader of the Japanese exclusion movement in California. And many people have identified V.S. McClatchy as a racist, which is certainly true, but it's also a little bit more complicated than that, in that really he's afraid of the Japanese, and he's afraid of what the Japanese might do in California if they come there in sufficient numbers. So he would very much like to restrict Japanese immigration to California. He would actually really like to expel a lot of Japanese from California. And he and Rhee enter into a partnership where Rhee feeds him information about what the Japanese are doing in Korea and about their repression of the Korean people, especially after the March 1st movement. And V.S. McClatchy is more than happy to publicize this to the Americans. He owns some newspapers. He's actually a part of the Associated Press, the AP. He's more than happy to publicize this to the American people, hoping that they can get them, he can stoke some animus against the Japanese and gain popular support for these Japanese exclusion laws. And Rhee is more than happy to help him out in this because he sees V.S. McClatchy as an ally in this anti-Japanese pursuit. So Rhee is certainly not afraid to work with people whose ideology may even be what we would think of as repugnant to someone like Rhee. I mean, now the question is, did Rhee think of McClatchy as a racist? Almost certainly he did not. But looking back, most people today would look at V.S. McClatchy as a very virulent racist, but that was not going to be a barrier to Rhee working with him. So Rhee was certainly an arch pragmatist. And I would say when we talk about Rhee as an anti-communist, even later in his life, I think it's important to understand that really what he is he's anti-Soviet. And he actually tries to walk a very fine line on communism from the moment he gets back in Korea in 1945 until it becomes obvious that there's not going to be any compromise with the Soviet Union. He actually tries to say some conciliatory things about communism. And I think even to the end of his life, he didn't have a major problem with a lot of the tenets of communist ideology. I mean, he did not think that they were particularly good ideas, but really he was very much anti-Soviet, and he saw North Korea as an extension of the Soviet Union.
And a lot of the Americans involved in all of this process, when they saw this, his first constitution and the way he ruled the country, they were actually quite fearful that he was himself a socialist.
They were, and some of the people I've written on this, some of the experts that the State Department hires to go over the Constitution, look at this and say, well, this is essentially patterned on the Weimar Republic in Germany. Essentially, what he is creating is a socialist state in terms of economic policy in the Republic of Korea. Now, he's also working to create an authoritarian state there. They don't really particularly care for either of these developments, but that's actually how they describe Syngman Rhee's policies, as this is essentially European-style socialism being translated onto Korea. So I think it's important when we label Lee Syngman as an anti-communist, we understand that he's anti-communist in the sense that he believes the Soviets are using communism to expand their empire into North Korea, and they want to expand that empire into South Korea as well. But just because he's anti-communist does not mean that he's a member of an extreme right-wing economic ideological faction, right? He's not into free trade. He supports state ownership of a number of key industries in Korea. So just because he's anti-communist does not mean that he aligns perfectly with anti-communism as it exists in the United States at that time.
So let's push forward here for a second.
That's quite a push forward.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But let's move into this question. So his career as a lecturer, what was that about, and how was it? It seems to be quite an important period in his life.
Yes, so he arrives at the United States late 1904. He starts studying at George Washington University in 1905, and he's doing this on the patronage of American missionaries and American missionary supporters in the United States. So he virtually has no money of his own. He comes to the United States almost penniless, but he carries more than a dozen letters of recommendation from Korean missionaries, or from American missionaries into Korea, recommending Lee Syngman to various churches and universities in the United States, saying, here is a future Korean leader who's showing real promise. Can you help secure him an education? The understanding being he has no money whatsoever to be able to pay for this. And so he goes to Washington. He meets some officials at George Washington University, and they agree that they'll give him a full scholarship and they'll support him in other ways. And he actually never has to pay. He does his undergraduate at George Washington, an MA at Harvard, and a PhD at Princeton, and this is all on scholarship from people who want to support him as someone who will go back to Korea as a missionary. So his education is provided for, but what they don't provide for him in most cases is room or board. So he needs a way to go out and make money. And he discovers very soon after he gets there that Korea is a topic that American Christians are interested in. Mission work there has been hard up to that point, but it's been showing some promise. And so American audiences are interested in hearing from an actual Korean about what their missionaries are doing in Korea. So he begins touring around to churches, first just local churches in Washington. He'll go there and he doesn't exactly preach. He more or less gives a lecture on Korea and on missionary activity there, and then they'll take up a free will offering. And this is what Syngman Rhee uses to support himself, to find room and board while he's a student. Now, as he gets better at English, his lectures get better and better, and he ends up really developing a reputation as quite an outstanding lecturer. Now, in 1907, there's what's called the Great Pyongyang Revival in Korea, in which Christianity in Korea explodes. And as Christianity in Korea explodes, so does Syngman Rhee's work as a lecturer, because the more converts there are, the more American churches want to hear about the work there. And the more, I mean, there's not many Koreans in the United States at this time, and most of them are laborers working in Hawaii, just a few of them in California. So Syngman Rhee almost is uniquely placed to be able to explain to Americans in terms that they can understand what's happening in Korea. And by this time, he's also probably the best educated Korean in the world. His fluency in English is becoming quite impressive, and he really makes his living for several years lecturing to American audiences.
And this, of course, is all going to move towards Syngman Rhee returning to Korea at some point. So let's move this back in a second and just explain what was the March 1st movement in Korea, and why is this important for Syngman Rhee? And because after this, he moves into the position as president of the Korean Provisional Government.
Yeah, so the March 1st movement happens on March 1st, 1919, and what it is it's a Korean attempt to show the world that they actually are, they're not an uncivilized people, as many people are believing at that time, as the Japanese are trying to tell the world. They're trying to tell people that they're capable of self-government, and also that they want their independence from Japan. And they do this at a moment when the great powers are meeting in Versailles in France in 1919 to bring an end to the First World War, and really they're hoping to establish some sort of international governance in the League of Nations that will be able to address issues like colonies wanting their independence. And so the Koreans know that this is going on, that this meeting is going on, but they also know that there's a lot of people wondering, well, do the Koreans even want to be independent? Because they've been occupied by the Japanese for the better part of 14 years, and we really haven't heard a lot from them. And so what they do is they organize a nationwide protest in which Koreans will just turn out in the streets. It's nonviolent, but they will wave Korean flags and they will yell, long live Korea, essentially, Mansei. And they will let the world know that they want to be independent from Japan. And what they're hoping is that the Japanese are going to respond in a violent manner that will bring the plight of Korea to the attention of the world. And the Japanese are happy to oblige them. They kill probably about 7,000 Koreans in just the first few days of this. The repression goes on for months after the March 1st movement, and this really brings the plight of Korea to international attention. This is widely covered in American newspapers. Missionaries are writing letters from Korea, letting people back at home know that the Japanese are now attacking Koreans, especially Korean Christians. And in the wake of this movement, the Koreans decide that they're going to form a provisional government. So they've been colonized for 14 years, but there's not been an official movement resisting this. And so the Koreans decide, we're going to create an official provisional government, a shadow government that is going to try to convince other nations to recognize it as the official representative of the Korean people. So when they get together to form this government, they have to decide who is going to be the leader of this. And as they elect Syngman Rhee as the first president of the Korean Provisional Government, and they do this probably because he is the most internationalized of all the Koreans. He's lived in the United States for many years. He has a PhD from Princeton. And also, while he was at Princeton, he actually was a student of Woodrow Wilson. He was a guest at the Wilson home, not infrequently. How close their relationship was is debatable, but they certainly had a relationship. And so they elect Syngman Rhee as president, hoping that he can use these connections in the United States and with Wilson to raise the issue of Korea in Versailles. Now, it's important to recognize that when they choose Syngman Rhee, they make a fateful choice, because there were other Korean leaders who had more of a military background, who were martial leaders who would have been much better if they were going to openly fight Japan for their independence. Syngman Rhee has none of that kind of experience whatsoever. And when they choose Syngman Rhee as their leader, they pretty much guarantee that the bulk of the energy of the Korean independence movement is going to go into winning back their independence on a moral or diplomatic grounds rather than on a military grounds.
And this is based in Shanghai, I think. And at some point, he is impeached from this position. Is this true?
This is true. So he's elected in 1919, and the government, the elections happen in Seoul, but obviously they cannot have their provisional government within Korea. It's under Japanese control. So they relocate to Shanghai. Syngman Rhee is actually not even able to get to Shanghai to assume the post of president for many months. It's very hard for him to travel from the United States because he's not an American citizen. He doesn't have an American passport. He refuses to travel on a Japanese passport. So there's a whole lot of headache for Syngman Rhee to travel. So he eventually gets to Shanghai. He only spends about, I believe it's around 9 months in Shanghai before he decides to leave, because he says, I can better serve Korean independence through my activism in the United States than through my direct presence in Shanghai overseeing this government, which is really a shadow government. I mean, they don't control anything on the Korean peninsula. It's really all about keeping up appearances. So he says, if we're going to keep up appearances, you keep up appearances here, I'll keep up appearances in the United States. There are many in the government that are disgusted with Rhee for this decision, that they think that he should be in Shanghai where the government is. And then there's the very, very contentious issue of funding. How are they going to get money to run this government? It's almost impossible to get money out of the Korean peninsula because it's so tightly controlled by the Japanese. So the bulk of their funding has to come from the United States. And this is where things start to break down with Rhee, leading towards his impeachment. And I'm going to be honest with you and say that this is a part of Rhee's life and a part of his political career that I have not invested a lot of scholarly resources in, because it's so much of a, let's say, he said situation where this whole movement is chronically short of money. It seems that people are upset with Rhee that he cannot get more money out of his supporters in the United States. They accuse him of wasting money in the United States on his own activities that should be spent on the Korean Provisional Government. And ultimately, he is impeached, and this government, it never ceases to exist, but it atrophies tremendously because of these interfactional disputes, which somewhat delve from strategic differences over whether we're going to fight the Japanese or whether we're going to take the diplomatic route. But I think at the source of all of this is really money. There's not enough money to do everything. And eventually these things come to a head, and Syngman Rhee is removed by the Korean Provisional Government, although he never actually rescinds his title. He's removed in 1926, but he never surrenders the title till the late 1930s, because he says, I was elected by the people in Korea. Until they elect someone else, I'm the president. So you have this awkward situation where he continues to claim he's the president of Korea, even though the KPG has other opinions about who is the president.
Well, let's dig into that. So we started a little bit earlier on in this conversation talking about the importance of diplomacy throughout this period. So let's go into this. So before he starts reaching out to, he's been reaching out to America all along, but at some point that same pragmatism comes forward, and he reaches out to Europe and indeed the Soviet Union in search of funding or support or diplomatic support. Yes,
he feels by about 1922 that he's hit a wall in the United States. And it's not that he's accomplished nothing. He's actually done a tremendous amount of work bringing Korea's plight to the attention of the American people. He's gotten, it's over 7,000 newspaper articles on Korea published. Now, it's not that these are all directly attributed to him, but the conscious raising that he has done has really brought Korea to the plight of the American people. But around 1922, he realizes that even though he's probably won the argument in terms of sympathy for Korea among the American people, the U.S. government is not going to do anything for Korea, because even if they wanted to, they're not going to fight the Japanese for Korea's independence. That is just not going to happen. And even Americans sympathetic towards the Korea would probably not support that. So he's hit a wall in the United States in about 1922. And what he does is he goes back to Hawaii. He never really abandons political activity, but he says, I'm going to devote my energies now towards improving the Korean population in Hawaii to create what would be kind of an advanced cadre of highly educated Koreans that at some point when the situation changes will have educated people who can return to Korea and refound an independent Korea. Now, around 1933 is when the Japanese invade Manchuria, and this becomes an issue that's going to be taken up by the League of Nations. And so in 1933, Rhee travels to Europe and spends a better part of 6 months in Geneva working to try to influence the League of Nations now to do something for Korea. Now that they're looking at the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, Rhee's argument is if you would have stopped the Japanese in Korea, you wouldn't have this problem. So when you think about solutions, you need to think about what you're going to do for the Korean people. He manages to actually influence a number of members of the League of Nations in Korea's plight. He gets some favorable media coverage. He gets some movement in the League of Nations, but it's obvious too by the end of this that the League of Nations is not going to, they don't have the power or the will to forcefully adjust the situation. So then he gets another idea, and that is of traveling to the Soviet Union. Now, it's unclear, it's rather cryptic. We don't have a full explanation of what he was attempting, but from his diary, it appears what he was going to propose was going to be a grand alliance of the Soviets and the Chinese in fighting the Japanese in Manchuria and in Korea. There's a number of Korean guerrilla fighters and Korean guerrilla outfits that are operating in Siberia and in China. And it seems that he was traveling to the Soviet Union to try to see if he could get in contact with them and maybe broker some sort of a deal where all three parties would work together. He actually secures a visa to travel to Moscow, which was a bit of a feat. It took him several weeks. But when he gets to Moscow, he's told immediately that he has to leave, that the visa was granted in error, and that he never should have come in the first place. Now, they're somewhat apologetic to him for doing this, but at the end of the day, he spends 24 hours in Moscow before he has to take a train right back to Geneva. So what he accomplishes that by doing this is almost nothing, but this trip is very important in what it reveals about his pragmatism as a Korean independence activist. If the Soviet Union would have been willing to offer him real material support, there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that he was prepared to take it.
So let's move to the other side of that pragmatism now. So back to America.
Yes.
And so during the 1940s, as the Washington representative of the Korean Provisional Government, you make just a remarkable claim here. You say that he uses the rhetoric which he's hearing around him of American exceptionalism, and he uses this to gain supporters inside the country. So he manipulates the idea for his own benefit.
That's exactly right. And I think, and actually, Lee Syngman is doing this from the moment he arrives in the United States. I think even at Peje, he begins to understand that there's this ideology that Americans have where they think that they have a special mission to do something in the world. And that is undeniably true about the missionaries that he is encountering there. And he recognizes this and thinks, well, there's a possibility for us here to enlist the Americans as a partner in the modernization of Korea. That's how he's thinking of it initially. So when he's lecturing in the United States early on in his career, what he's encouraging Americans to do is to support American missionaries in Korea to create a Christianized Korea, which will be a democracy, which will be it will essentially be a little United States in Korea. And of course, if you know much about American history, there's a large segment of the American population that loves this kind of thing, that thinks that this is exactly what the United States should be doing in its foreign policy. So he's been doing this for a long time. Now, what he does in the late 1930s is he realizes that Japan and the United States are on a collision course. He's not the only person to realize this, but he does realize it, and he writes a book called Japan Inside Out, which has the remarkable good fortune to be published in the summer of 1941. And what he tells the United States is, initially your relations in Asia were so good. You were promoting Christianity, you were promoting democracy, you were promoting modernization. But at somewhere along the way, you lost your way, and you instead decided to support the Japanese. You let them invade Korea. You let them do all these other kinds of things, and sooner or later the Japanese are going to attack you. right? Sooner or later, this is going to come back to haunt you. You're selling out of Korea.
So well, since he foresaw the coming of the Pearl Harbor attack.
He absolutely, I mean, he never said Hawaii, he never said any of the Pacifics, but he certainly foresaw that attack and said that the Koreans had been warning the United States about that for years. And then when the attack actually comes, he is more than happy to play the role of spurned prophet. And there's a remarkable speech that he gives, which I quote in my forthcoming book, where he tells an audience in Washington, D.C. in 1942, he says, now I don't want to say this in any recriminating way, that we, the Koreans, told you this was going to happen, but we did. That is exactly what he tells the American people. And furthermore, what he tells the American people is, actually, it's not your fault. It's the fault of your government. I know that you as individual Americans would never have let this happen. You would have defended Korea in 1905. You would have aggressively have supported your American missionaries there into Christianizing Korea. It's your government that's essentially sold us out. And so now what you need to do is you need to place pressure on your government to do the right thing for Korea, which throughout the war means recognizing the Korean Provisional Government as the only legitimate government on the Korean Peninsula, and as the government that will come over and take possession of the Korean Peninsula once the Japanese are defeated.
So he's actively influencing American policy towards Korea during the Second World War here.
He is, and he does this by creating a grassroots movement, which then puts pressure on their congressmen to do something about Korea. And one of the most remarkable things that I discovered, and again, so just to take a step back, this is all discoveries that came out when Syngman Rhee's diary was published. It wasn't published until actually it was published in late 2015. Is that we actually knew who his friends were. And we knew that he was meeting congressmen. We knew that he was meeting senators. We knew that he was meeting Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Fiorello LaGuardia. We knew that he was meeting very influential people at this time. And by getting those names, I was actually able to go through the congressional record and see what these people were saying about Korea. And what I discovered is that from May until July of 1945, this is in the closing months of the war, there were repeatedly, U.S. congressmen were saying on the floor of the U.S. Congress, we have to do something about Korea. We sold out Korea earlier in this century, and we cannot sell them out again, meaning Korea has to be completely separated from Japan. We cannot leave Korea in possession of the Japanese, and also we cannot cede Korea to the Soviet Union. Now, this created a big headache for the State Department because it was unclear exactly what they could do for Korea. They were convinced that recognizing the KPG would actually not accomplish anything besides probably encouraging the Soviets to create their own Soviet government in advance and march that into Korea. And also, they couldn't split their allies before the war was over. They recognized that Korea was going to be a contentious issue between the U.S., China, and the Soviet Union, and they could not let that happen before the Japanese were actually defeated. So they're under immense pressure to do something, but they can't do anything. And this just allows Syngman Rhee to rile up his supporters even more and demand to know why they're not acting on behalf of Korea. And so I argue in my book coming out, it's actually quite a remarkable claim that I'm very excited to make, but it's all of these pressures from the congressmen, from the grassroots movement, that eventually convinces the State Department they have to do something for Korea in the post-war period. And so it's after the Japanese surrender that the State, War, and Navy coordinating committees are sitting down. They're trying to hash out a peace agreement with the Japanese, and they have to decide what to do about Korea. And it comes out that the State Department wants all of Korea. They want as much of Korea as possible. And the War Department wants none of Korea whatsoever. They say Korea is a strategic liability. Besides, the Soviets are right next door. We are still 6 weeks away at best. We can't do anything. And so the compromise that they come up with is to suggest the division of Korea to the Soviet Union. Now, they do this expecting, or at least half expecting, that the Soviets are going to turn them down, because there's really no reason why the Soviets should say yes to this, because they're in position to have all of Korea. And their thinking is that once the Soviets turn them down, then they can at least tell these congressmen and the supporters of Korea that, look, we tried to do something for the Koreans, but we just were not in a position to do anything. We did the best that they could. However, as we all know, they don't get turned down. The Soviets agree to it, and then the United States is left to begin an occupation that they have no real plans for, and that they didn't really want in the first place. The War Department never wanted that. And it's important to understand that I am not trying to pin responsibility for the division of Korea on Syngman Rhee, because Syngman Rhee never advocated for this at all. In fact, he was horrified by the division of Korea immediately, and immediately started protesting it. But what he was advocating for was demanding that the United States do something for Korea by recognizing the Korean Provisional Government. Well, this demand created this movement that then ended up in these results that he really did not care for at all.
So through Syngman Rhee's lobbying of the US government, through his real strong push for an independent, single, nationalized Korea, he in fact has a huge influence on the division of Korea itself, this thing that he never wanted to come about.
That is exactly my argument. And he's very influential in that, but it's an influence that horrified him. And it's an influence that, of course, he never claimed. Through the rest of his career, he does not want to talk very much about what he was doing in World War II, because I think he recognizes that he contributed to this decision very much against his will. And as I say, he came out and he attacked that decision immediately. But I think it's safe to say that without Lee Seung-man and without his lobbying, it's highly unlikely that Korea would be divided in the first place. Now, I also have to say that his lobbying alone was not sufficient. I mean, really, the division of Korea happens because of a remarkable set of circumstances. If the Japanese hold out a little bit longer, then the Soviets are going to be in control of all of Korea, and a divided Korea does not happen, right? If the Americans decide to pursue a different strategy against Japan, not use atomic weapons, they decide instead for a quarantine of the Japanese home islands and Korea, you could imagine an outcome happening very differently as well. So Syngman Rhee's lobbying alone was not going to result in the division of Korea, but Syngman Rhee's lobbying, when it was coupled with the vagaries of that historical moment, made the division of Korea both technically possible and also politically desirable for many Americans in the State Department.
So this is coming to the very end here. So let's finish with a picture of what happens here. So Syngman Rhee returns back to Korea, and it's now a divided Korea by the time he arrives. And of course, he actually arrives in South Korea 6 days after Kim Il-sung arrives in North Korea. And what is this picture? Because the image that comes across is a man that almost immediately begins to cause problems for the Americans that are supporting him, because it's them that are sending him back. It's them that are eventually putting him into power and giving him all this, all the sort of authoritarian impulse that he's after here.
Well, we have to be careful about a couple of things.
Sure.
So when you say it's the Americans that sent him back, actually, Syngman Rhee returning to Korea is a very, very divisive issue. The State Department does everything they can actually to prevent him from returning to Korea, and it's the War Department that really wants to bring him back. Syngman Rhee is a persona non grata with the State Department after March of 1945, when he doesn't insinuate, he gives a press conference that the State Department has sold Korea out to the Soviet Union. This is March of 1945, that Roosevelt signed a secret deal at Yalta in which Korea was going to be given to the Soviets. Now, this was not true, although you will find Soviets today you'll find Koreans today that believe this, but this was certainly not true. But what it did is it made a lot of Americans very, very suspicious about the State Department. And it made them wonder, had the State Department made some sort of deal trading Korea for a Soviet entry into the Pacific War? And this just makes American diplomats in the State Department irate, that he would go to these lengths to try to increase his own influence in the United States and to try to force the American hand to do something to assist Korea. So he is a persona non grata with the State Department from that point on. It's the War Department that wants to bring Rhee back. And they want to bring him back because they recognize that he has legitimacy with the Koreans, going all the way back to his time as an independence activist, right? He is someone that Koreans know, and he is someone that Koreans know is an ardent nationalist who is not tainted by any sort of association with the Japanese. Those people are in relatively short supply. Now, what they don't know is that he absolutely abhors division. And so when the War Department brings him back, they get him out in front of Koreans right away to give a speech in which they think he is going to encourage them to work closely with the Americans. And the first question he asks is, why was Korea divided? and when is this division going to be erased? And immediately they realize that they have a problem on their hands because Lee Syngman has his own agenda. And his own agenda is to see a united, independent Korea. And that is not their policy. Their policy is that Korea is going to be divided until the United States and the Soviet Union can come to some sort of agreement on how to reunite it. And Lee Syngman is not okay with that. He wants a reunification and Korean independence immediately. And it causes no end of friction between him and the American military government in Korea.
So he's returned to Korea and he's immediately fighting for this single nationalized Korea that he's after. So I think feels like that's a pretty good point to leave this on. If we push any further, we're going to go past 1945 here.
Yes, and so I chose to stop the story there because, and initially in my book I was going to go further, but I felt like what I had discovered about the origins of the division of Korea was so important that if I went any further, that risked getting buried in the book. And so I finished that book and it's off the press, and now I'm already working on a second book, which will be the story from 1945 to 1965, the end of Rhee's life. That will deal with his time as the president of Korea. That's a period that's much better known. But still, I think I've discovered a lot of things in this period of his life as well that will be surprising to especially American audiences.
Well, when that second book comes out, I'll definitely have you back on the podcast. So your book is coming out, I believe, at the end of this year or early next year, is it?
March of 19 is the...
And that's with the University of Kentucky Press?
That's correct, yes.
Great. So anyone listening, you should pay attention and definitely get hold of that book and keep your eyes out for the second one down the line. So David Fields, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.